Most people think French is hard, but what if I told you that it's actually way easier than you think? Not only that, there's a long list of languages that, if you already speak them, give you a massive head start in French. Stick around to the end to see if yours is on the list. Quick disclaimer, I'm not a linguist, nor am I an academic of any kind. This is just based on my personal experience, as well as what I've heard from my students and people that I've met. There's a good chance that I won't cover every language that fits, so if I missed anything, feel free to let me know in the comments below. Just before we get into it, if you want some extra help in your French learning journey, I've set up a Patreon where I do live Q&A sessions, plus there's also a private Discord community where you can practice with other French learners. If you're looking for something more personalized, I also do one-on-one French lessons online, and you can even book a free trial session with the Calendly link below. All right, without further ado, let's get into it. One thing I've never really talked about was how much knowing Chinese and Japanese helped me sound natural in French. Starting off with Chinese, what Chinese helped me with specifically in French was nailing intonation. Now, French isn't a tonal language by any means, but there are some scenarios where knowing the intonation can really come in handy. And I guess the best example of this is the word la, which can mean many things depending on the tone you use when you say it. Take the sentence, Qu'est-ce que tu fais là? If you said it the way I just did, with a very flat tone, it would mean, what are you doing here? But you could also say, Qu'est-ce que tu fais là? And that would mean, what are you doing right now? Qu'est-ce que tu fais là versus Qu'est-ce que tu fais là? See the difference? Sometimes people even combine the two, so you could end up with a sentence that sounds like Qu'est-ce que tu fais là là? Which means, what are you doing over there right now? A more common example of this would be the phrase C'est là là, which means it's right over there. The two different tones here literally correspond to two of the four tones in Mandarin, specifically the third and the fourth. I have a feeling that this is something that's quite hard to grasp or even notice if you don't come from a tonal language, since I've only ever heard native French people speak this way. I don't know any other non-native French speaker that's been able to replicate this as easily as I have, so it's pretty cool to see how my knowledge of Mandarin helps me so much with sounding natural in French here. Japanese helped me a lot with French because it got me used to pronouncing things without diphthongs, and this is something that most native English speakers struggle with when speaking French. Diphthongs are what happens when you blend two vowels within a single syllable, and this is extremely common in English, to the point where almost every word, especially in American English, is pronounced with a diphthong. For example, the words know and show blend the vowels O and U at the end, okay and steak blend the vowels E and I, but none of this blending happens in French. So in French, these words would just sound like no, chaud, okay, and steak. Hear the difference? Most syllables in French are pronounced with one sharp sound, and this is very similar to Japanese, which actually takes it even further because in Japanese there are technically no diphthongs at all, since every syllable only has one vowel. I think the best example of this is the word anime, which, as you can hear again, has a diphthong at the very end when pronounced in English, anime, while in French and Japanese, they sound almost the exact same. So, anime in Japanese and anime in French. Many native English speakers just can't help putting diphthongs everywhere, and I'm just glad that my exposure to Japanese prevented that from happening. This is also one of the biggest reasons why French people have a way easier time with Japanese pronunciation than English pronunciation. If you speak Spanish, Portuguese, German, Dutch, Danish, Arabic, or even Scottish or Irish English, you already know how to make one of the most dreaded sounds in French, which is the French R. While not every language on this list has a sound that's completely identical, they all have consonants that are at least produced with the same general mechanics as the French R, meaning they come from the back of the mouth or the throat. For example, the word red in German is pronounced as rot, and this is pretty much the same thing in Dutch where it's pronounced rood. For Danish, an easier example will be the word rug, which means back. I read on Wikipedia that Danish actually adopted the guttural R sound because of French influence, and if that's true, then that's actually quite interesting. In Spanish, you have the word trabajar, which means work, and you can kind of see here how the J in this word resembles the French R sound. In Portuguese, you have the word carro, which means car, and that's pretty much the same sound as the French R. I know the word for brother in Levantine Arabic is kheye, and in Moroccan Arabic, it's hoya. And then you also have the name Khaled or Khalid, And these really resemble the French R sound if they're not already the same sound. If you're Scottish or Irish, chances are you've at least had to learn how to pronounce Gaelic names like Lachlan or Loch Ness correctly, even if you don't actually speak Gaelic itself. The h sound in these words isn't exactly the same as the French R sound, which is more like r, but it's produced in the same part of the throat as the French R, so you're pretty much already there, and you just gotta make a tiny adjustment. If you don't speak any of these languages though, and you find it physically impossible to produce the French R sound, don't worry. It's nowhere near as important as you think it is. You could speak French with English R's or rolled R's for the rest of your life and still be perfectly understood. And no French person is ever gonna judge you for this because it barely matters, even to them. What's actually really important though is nailing the nasal vowels, the liaison, and the French U. Speaking of the French U, which is pronounced as U, if you speak Chinese, Swedish, Norwegian, British English, and again, Dutch or German, you already know how to make the sound. And you should feel good about this because this U sound comes very unintuitively for most people who don't speak these languages. Many people go an entire lifetime without ever learning how to pronounce this U sound correctly, so take this as motivation to start learning French if you haven't already. Starting off again with Chinese, there are two types of U sounds, U and U. The second one is exactly the same as the French U, and you absolutely have to nail the pronunciation if you want anyone to even have a chance of understanding what it is you're trying to say. For example, lu means green, but if you mispronounce the U, you could end up saying lu, which means road. Completely different things. You could get away with messing up the tones in Chinese, but you can't get anywhere if you mess up the vowels, and in that sense, Chinese is very similar to French. Chinese is actually way stricter with vowels than French is, now that I think about it. Moving on to the Nordic languages on this list. In Swedish or Norwegian, you have the long U's and the long Y's in words such as kul, which means fun, fyra, which means four, by, which means city or village, and hus, which means house. And all of these vowels sound just like the French U. If you speak British English, the U in Tuesday also sounds very similar, if not the same. Bringing back Dutch and German, the German U with umlaut and the Dutch long U are the exact same sounds as the French U. For example, in German you have the words üben and für, which means practice and for, and in Dutch you have the words duur and excuus, which means expensive and excuse. It's pretty interesting to see how, even though Dutch and German aren't even Romance languages like French is, they actually have more in common with French in terms of pronunciation than any of the major Romance languages do. Anyways, if you need help learning how to pronounce the French U, I actually have a video on that already, so feel free to check that out. It's a really important sound to master if you want to be understood clearly. And I promise you, it's actually way easier than you think because it's purely mechanical. Speaking of Romance languages, I think it's quite obvious that if you already speak Italian, Spanish, or Portuguese, you'll have the easiest time learning how to use French compared to everyone else because the grammar is as similar as it gets. In fact, French grammar is actually way easier in so many fundamental aspects. You have to learn so much more, even just to become conversational alone in Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese compared to French. And I can talk all day about this, but for the sake of time, I'll just be as concise as I can. Starting off with tenses, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese all have way more tenses in the spoken language than French does. They all have multiple progressive tenses to describe ongoing actions, whether it be in the past or present, while the concept of a progressive tense doesn't even exist in French. There are so many more forms of the subjunctive that have to be used a lot, even in everyday conversation, whereas in French, you can mostly get away without using it since it only gets triggered by very predictable and fixed expressions, and you really only need to know the present subjunctive anyway. Spanish and Italian also use way more tenses when talking about the past. So, for example, on top of the 2 to 3 core past tenses in Romance languages, Spanish also has the pretérito indefinido, and Italian has the passato remoto, whereas the French version of this, the passé simple, doesn't even exist in the spoken language. Also, when it comes to verb conjugation, French also has an advantage in pronunciation because most of the verb endings sound the same. So even though the spelling looks complex, what you end up having to pronounce is often much simpler than in Spanish or Italian, where each form or each verb ending is actually very distinct. Even when it comes to basic grammar like prepositions, for example, French is so much easier. Like, Italian has 35 contractions, while French only has 4. which is insane. Every time I use the main 5 prepositions in Italian, so di, a, da, in, and su, I have to think about the gender, the quantity, and the spelling of the following noun, and it feels like I'm spending so much more brain power on these little connectors that don't even add much meaning to the sentence. French also has the least number of articles compared to the other Romance languages. There's only 6, while Spanish and Portuguese both have 8, and Italian has more than 11. French is also the only Romance language here that doesn't have a difference in spelling between the cardinal and ordinal numbers, so that's stuff like first, second, and third, nor does it have gendered ordinal numbers. Aside from premier and première, everything else follows the same pattern with the em ending, so deuxième for second, troisième for third, quatrième for fourth, and so on and so forth. Like, it's very consistent. On the other hand, all the ordinal numbers in Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese are all spelled differently, and you also have to agree them with the gender of the noun that comes after. So that's just more to think about, again. Because of all these little things, French is actually so much more streamlined for everyday use compared to the other Romance languages. Of course, French does have its own set of challenges, like pronunciation and listening, but grammatically speaking, it's probably the easiest Romance language to learn. So if you already speak a Romance language, there's really no reason to feel intimidated by the idea of learning French. Last but not least, if you speak English, you'd actually have an easier time learning French because out of all the non-Romance languages, English actually has the most French influence by far. There's a crazy amount of shared vocabulary, whether it be nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, sometimes with the exact same spelling. In fact, at least 29% of modern English is derived from French. French also sticks to the same sentence structure as English, so subject, verb, and object, and it's not like the other Romance languages where you drop the subject and you just start straight with the verb in a sentence, and that for me did take me some time getting used to when I was learning Italian as an English speaker. So between the vocabulary and the structure, you're constantly getting these little moments of recognition, and that makes the whole process way less overwhelming. I actually have an entire video breaking down how French is actually easy to learn for English speakers, so I'm not gonna go into all the details here and basically repeat the same thing, but I highly recommend checking that out if you're interested. Alright guys, those were all the languages that I could think of that make French easier to learn. Let me know in the comments below what you guys think or whether I missed anything. I always love reading what you guys have to say. Again, if you want to learn French with someone who knows exactly what you're struggling with, feel free to join my Patreon. You'll get access to both live Q&A sessions to help you in your language learning journey, as well as our private Discord community of fellow French learners. And if you want to take it a step further and take one-on-one classes with me, feel free to sign up for a free trial session with the Calendly link below. I hope this video was interesting for you guys at the very least, and until next time, have a great rest of your day. Bye guys, love you.